Chapter, Introduction, Episode 11, Marriage as a Tool, Next Step. The dying man had spoken to no one but him. The mother was to know nothing. The children were only 4 or 5 years old. He circulated the intelligence that his friend, upon expiring, had left his fortune to the poor. The rascal acquired it the same day. But to ruin those wretched children did not suffice. Furnished with authority by their father, the bishop, who never committed one crime without instantly conceiving another, had the children removed from the remote pension in which they were being brought up, and placed them under the roof of certain people in his hire, from the outset having resolved soon to make them serve his perfidious lust. He waited until they were 13. The little boy was the first to arrive at that age. The bishop put him to use, bent him to all his debauches, and as he was extremely pretty, sported with him for a week. But the little girl fared less well. She reached the prescribed age, but was very ugly, a fact which had no mitigating effect upon the good bishop's lubricious fury. His desires appeased, he feared lest these children, left alive, would someday discover something of the secret of their interests. Therefore, he conducted them to an estate belonging to his brother, and, sure of recapturing, by means of a new crime, the sparks of lechery enjoyment had just caused him to lose, he immolated both of them to his ferocious passions, and accompanied their death with episodes so piquant and so cruel that his voluptuousness was reborn in the midst of the torments wherewith he beset them. The thing is, unhappily, only too well known. There is no libertine, at least a little steeped in vice, who is not aware of the great sway murder exerts over the senses, and how voluptuously it determines a discharge. And that is a general truth, whereof it were well the reader be early advised before undertaking the perusal of a work which will surely attempt an ample development of this system. Henceforth at ease in the face of whatever might transpire, Monseigneur returned to Paris to enjoy the fruit of his misdeeds, and without the least qualms about having counteracted the intentions of a man who in his present situation was in no state to derive either pain or pleasure therefrom. The President de Courval was a pillar of society, almost 60 years of age, and worn by debauchery to a singular degree. He offered the eye not much more than a skeleton. He was tall, he was dry, thin, had 2 blue lustreless eyes, a livid and unwholesome mouth, a prominent chin, a long nose, hairy as a satyr, flat-backed with slack, drooping buttocks that rather resembled a pair of dirty rags flapping upon his upper thighs. The skin of those buttocks was, thanks to wit strokes, so deadened and toughened that you could seize up a handful and knead it without his feeling a thing. In the center of it all, there was displayed, no need to spread those cheeks, an immense orifice whose enormous diameter, odor, and color bore a closer resemblance to the depths of a well-freighted privy than to an asshole. And, crowning touch to these allurements, there was numbered among this sodomizing pig's little idiosyncrasies that of Chapter, Introduction, Episode 12, Wives as Shields to Power, always leaving this particular part of himself in such a state of uncleanliness that one was at all times able to observe there a rim or pad a good 2 inches thick. Below a belly as wrinkled as it was livid and gummy, one perceived, within a forest of hairs, a tool which in its erectile condition might have been about 8 inches long and 7 around, but this condition had come to be the most rare, and to procure it a furious sequence of things was the necessary preliminary. Nevertheless, the event occurred at least 2 or 3 times each week, and upon these occasions the President would glide into every hole to be found, indiscriminately, although that of a young lad's behind was infinitely the most precious to him. The head of the President's device was now at all times exposed, for he had had himself circumcised, a ceremony which largely facilitates enjoyment and to which all pleasure-loving persons ought to submit. But one of the purposes of the same operation is to keep this privity cleaner. Nothing of the sort in Curville's case. This part of him was just as filthy as the other. This uncapped head, naturally quite thick to begin with, was thus made at least an inch ampler in circumference. Similarly untidy about all the rest of his person, the president, who furthermore had tastes at the very least as nasty as his appearance, had become a figure whose rather malodorous vicinity might not have succeeded in pleasing everyone. However, his colleagues were not at all of the sort to be scandalized by such trifles, and they simply avoided discussing the matter with him. Few mortals had been as free in their behavior or as debauches as the president, but, entirely jaded, absolutely besotted, all that remained to him was the deprivation and lewd profligacy of libertinage. Above 3 hours of excess, and of the most outrageous excess, were needed before one could hope to inspire a voluptuous reaction in him. As for his emission, although in Curville the phenomenon was far more frequent than erection, and could be observed once every day, it was all the same so difficult to obtain, or it never occurred save as an aftermath to things so strange and often so cruel or so unclean, that the agents of his pleasure not uncommonly renounced the struggle, fainting by the wayside, the which would give birth in him to a kind of lubricious anger, and this through its effects would now and again triumph where his efforts had failed. Curville was to such a point mired down in the morass of vice and libertinage that it had become virtually impossible for him to think or speak of anything else. He unendingly had the most appalling expressions in his mouth, just as he had the vilest designs in his heart, and these, with surpassing energy, he mingled with blasphemies and imprecations supplied him by his true horror, a sentiment he shared with his companions, for everything that smacked of religion. This disorder of mind, yet further augmented by the almost continual intoxication in which he was fond of keeping himself, had during the past few years given him an air of imbecility and prostration which, he would declare, made for his most cherished delight. Born as great a gourmand as a drunk, he alone was fit to keep abreast of the Duke, and in the
Chapter Introduction, Episode 13, The Triangle of Alliances. Course of this tale, we will behold him to perform wonders, which will no doubt astonish the most veteran eaters. It had been 10 years since Curville had ceased to discharge his judicial duties. It was not simply that he was no longer fit to carry them out, but I even believe that while he had been, he may have been asked to leave these matters alone for the rest of his life. Curville had led a very libertine life. Every sort of perversion was familiar to him, and those who knew him personally had the strong suspicion he owed his vast fortune to nothing other than 2 or 3 murders. However that may be, it is, in the light of the following story, highly probable that this variety of extravagance had the power to stir him deeply, and it is this adventure, which attracted some unfortunate publicity, that was responsible for his exclusion from the court. We are going to relate the episode in order to give the reader an idea of his character. There dwelled in the neighborhood of Curville's townhouse a miserable street porter who, the father of a charming little girl, was ridiculous enough to be a person of sensibility. 20 messages of every kind had already arrived containing proposals relating to the poor fellow's daughter. He and his wife had remained unshaken despite this barrage aimed at their corruption, and Curville, the source of these embassies, only irritated by the growing number of refusals they had evoked, knew not what tack to take in order to get his hands upon the girl and to subject her to his libidinous caprices, until it struck to him that by simply having the father broken, he would lead the daughter to his bed. The thing was as nicely conceived as executed. 2 or 3 bullies in the president's pay intervened in the suit, and before the month was out, the wretched porter was enmeshed in an imaginary crime which seemed to have been committed at his door, and which got him speedily lodged in one of the conciergerie's dungeons. The president, as one would expect, soon took charge of the case, and having no desire to permit it to drag on, arranged in the space of 3 days, thanks to his knavery and his gold, to have the unlucky porter condemned to be broken on the wheel, without the culprit ever having committed any crime but that of wishing to preserve his honor and safeguard his daughters. Meanwhile, the solicitations were renewed. The mother was brought in. It was explained to her that she alone had it in her power to save her husband, that if she were to satisfy the president, what could be clearer than that he would thereupon snatch her husband from the dreadful fate awaiting him? Further hesitation was impossible. The woman made inquiries. Clerval knew perfectly well to whom she addressed herself. The counsels were his creatures, and they gave her unambiguous replies. She ought not waste a moment. The poor woman herself brought her daughter weeping to her judge's feet. The latter could not have been more liberal with his
Chapter. Introduction. Episode 14. Expanding the pact promises, nor have been less eager to keep his word. Not only did he fear lest, were he to deal honorably and spare the husband, the man might go and raise an uproar upon discovering the price that had been paid to save his life, but the scoundrel even found a further delight, a yet keener one, in arranging to have himself given what he wished, without being obliged to make any return. This thought led to others. Numerous criminal possibilities entered his head, and their effect was to increase his perfidious lubricity. And this is how he set about the matter, so as to put the maximum of infamy and piquancy into the scene. His mansion stood facing a spot where criminals are sometimes executed in Paris, and as this particular offense had been committed in that quarter of the city, he won assurance the punishment would be meted out on this particular square. The wretch's wife and daughter arrived at the president's home at the appointed hour. All windows overlooking the square were well shuttered, so that, from the apartments where he amused himself with his victims, nothing at all could be seen of what was going on outside. Apprised of the exact minute of the execution, the rascal selected it for the deflowering of the little girl who was held in her mother's arms. And everything was so happily arranged that Clerval discharged into the child's ass the moment her father expired. Instantly, he'd completed his business. "Come have a look," quoth he, opening a window looking upon the square. "Come see how well I've kept my bargain." And one of his 2 princesses saw her father, the other her husband, delivering up his soul to the headsman's steel. Both collapsed in a faint, but Clerval had provided for everything. This swoon was their agony. They'd both been poisoned, and never more opened their eyes. Notwithstanding the precautions he had taken to swathe the whole of this exploit in the most profound mystery, something did indeed transpire. Nothing was known of the women's death, but there existed a lively suspicion he had been untruthful in connection with the husband's case. His motive was half known, and his eventual retirement from the bench was the outcome. As of this moment, no longer having to maintain appearances, Clerval flung himself into a new ocean of errors and crimes. He sent everywhere for victims to sacrifice to the perversity of his tastes. Through an atrocious refinement of cruelty, but one, however, very easily understood, the downtrodden classes were those upon which he most enjoyed hurling the effects of his raging perfidy. He had several minions who were abroad night and day, scouring attics and hovels, tracking down whatever of the most destitute misery might be able to provide, and under the pretext of dispensing aid, either he envenomed his catch, to give poison was one of his most delectable pastimes, or he lured it to his house and slew it upon the altar of his perverse preferences. Men, women, children, anything was fuel to his rage, and at its bidding he performed excesses which would have got his head between.
Chapter, Introduction, Episode 15, The Final Agreement, Block and blade 1,000 times over, were it not for the silver he distributed and the esteem he enjoyed, factors whereby he was 1,000 times protected. One may well imagine such a being had no more religion than his two confreres. He without doubt detested it as sovereignly as they, but in years past had done more to wither it in others. For, in the days when his mind had been sound, it had also been clever, and he had put it to good use writing against religion. He was the author of several works whose influence had been prodigious, and these successes, always present in his memory, still constituted one of his dearest delights. The more we multiply the objects of our enjoyments: 1. The years of a sickly childhood. 2. Dorset is 53. He is small, short, broad, thick-set, an agreeable, hearty face, a very white skin, his entire body, and principally his hips and buttocks, absolutely like a woman's. His ass is cool and fresh, chubby, firm and dimpled, but excessively agape, owing to the habit of sodomy. His prick is extraordinarily small, 'tis scarcely 2 inches around, no more than 4 inches long. It has entirely ceased to stiffen. His discharges are rare and uneasy, far from abundant, and always preceded by spasms which hurl him into a kind of furor, which in turn conducts him to crime. He has a chest like a woman's, a sweet, pleasant voice, and, when in society, the best bred manners, although his mind is without question as depraved as his colleagues. A schoolmate of the Duke, they still sport together every day, and one of Dorset's loftiest pleasures is to have his anus tickled by the Duke's enormous member. And such, dear reader, are the 4 villains in whose company I am going to have you pass a few months. I have done my best to describe them, if, as I have wished, I have made you familiar with even their most secret depths. Nothing in the tale of their various follies will astonish you. I have not been able to enter into minute detail with what regards their tastes. To have done so now would have been to impair the value and to harm the main scheme of this work. But as we move progressively along, you will have but to keep an attentive eye upon our heroes, and you'll have no trouble discerning their characteristic peccadillos and the particular type of voluptuous mania which best suits each of them. Roughly all we can say at the present time is that they were generally susceptible of an enthusiasm for sodomy, that the 4 of them had themselves buggered regularly, and that they all 4 worshipped behinds. The Duke, however, relative to the immensity of his weapon, and doubtless more through cruelty than from taste, still fucked cunts with the greatest pleasure. 1. Place here the portrait of Dorset as it is in Notebook 18, the one that's bound in pink. Then, after having concluded this portrait with the words under A in the notebooks, continue with B.